This is a trial from the heavens above.
I absolutely adore the Devil May Cry series, not only for its bright, charismatic characters and thematic elements that people sometimes dismiss due to the lighthearted delivery of most of its story, but also because of its incredibly investing, satisfying, and deep combat that allows for a wide variety of ways to not just dispose of your enemies, but to do it incredibly stylishly. There's no bad way to get that style meter up to S or above, as long as you do it at all. The game wants it. The game wants you to express yourself through insane combos, crazy juggles, and well-timed taunts in whatever manner suits your taste, utilizing the long list of moves and weapons at your disposal. Despite being a series that's quite linear in things like story progression and level design, it boasts the most open-ended action combat available today. In fact, it pretty much invented the modern character action genre back when the first game came out in 2001. For a pioneering franchise of a certain genre to still stay at the top almost 20 years later is a hell of a feat, even if it did stagger a bit in some places. Before we continue on, let me explain what a character action game is, for those who are unsure. There's a tiny bit of contention over the specifics of what makes a game character action, as it's not a clearly defined subgenre. So not every game will perfectly fall into the exact same criteria, but hopefully I get the gist of it across. Typically, they are fast-paced, single-player action games where you control a character that has a long move list of attacks, often both melee and ranged, and you're usually able to unlock more by spending some type of currency and acquiring new weapons. The main purpose of these games is to improve your combat capabilities by simply learning how to properly implement the massive amount of moves available to you and simply being as stylish as possible with them. Generally, a game in this genre allows you to perform ground combos, air combos, parries, dodges, on-the-fly weapon switching, and often a few special mobility options, encouraging you to link them all together in one beautiful, non-stop sequence. Basically, the focus is entirely on mastering your character, hence the phrase character action. In a pure character action game, you don't level up, you don't get randomized loot, and you don't get stat points to permanently allocate into your attack power or defense, though it is common to increase health. You're just given tools, and it's up to you to decide how you use them. It's also common to see some type of grading or scoring system during or after each fight or level to encourage the player to replay the game many times and master every encounter, the most iconic being DMC's own style meter. Besides Devil May Cry, other character action titles include Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, Ninja Gaiden, God Hand, Vanquish, and Wonderful 101. However, there are also some action RPGs that share some DNA with character action games, such as Kingdom Hearts, Nier, and Nioh. The one thing that gives these games their combat depth is the ability to use almost any attack or move you want, whenever you want, and have it be viable in some way in whatever fight you're in. You're not forced to abide by some restrictive system like, only this specific weapon hurts this specific enemy, or you have to respond to this specific attack with this specific move or you won't make any progress in the fight. This unparalleled combat freedom grants you the opportunity to play however you want and allows masters of the genre to perform insane, uninterrupted combos that can sometimes last minutes, or, conversely, totally devastate bosses in mere seconds. The ways you can experience a character action game isn't just a slider, it's a spectrum, and Devil May Cry is the series that pioneered the genre as we know it now. Now that that explanation's done, let's move on with the video. DMC is not a difficult game to get into. I've seen the occasional comment from prospective players hesitant to start their first Devil May Cry game out of worries that the crazy awesome combo videos they see is the minimum performance the game expects from players. And thankfully, it isn't. As ridiculously complex as the combat can get at a high level, it's actually a very welcoming series too, with several difficulty modes and an assist option that lets you do complex stuff automatically by just hitting one button, though some experienced DMC players would recommend not using it if you intend to truly learn the nuances of the combat. Regardless, as monumentally high as gameplay limits are, its minimum demands are actually quite low, which is good for first-time players who want to jump in without the pressure of performing like combo masters from the get-go. But, judging from some of the comments you may see from the franchise's more vocal detractors, you could be led to thinking that the minimum is too low. Which leads me to the main topic of this video, perception of combat depth. To provide a bit more context on what I mean, let's roll back the clock a bit to early 2019, where the world was preparing for the launch of the long-awaited Devil May Cry 5, a follow-up to Devil May Cry 4 over a decade in the making. Fans of the series were getting hype. People were blasting Devil Trigger from their speakers for months in anticipation. We were finally getting a return from our lovable, crazy, party-time wahoo pizza man Uncle Dante and the headstrong Nero. And maybe, just maybe, if we're lucky, we'll get some Virgil action too. Hopes and dreams were flying high, and the people were fidgeting with excitement and having some laughs. Among those laughs was an amusing bingo card that went around predicting what reviewers would say about the upcoming game, poking fun at their potential obliviousness and tone-deaf comments that would only serve to aggravate fans and expose their general lack of knowledge about the game. Many DMC fans definitely anticipated inane statements from journalists, including clueless comparisons to Dark Souls, Bloodborne, God of War, or Batman. At worst, the bingo card probably comes off as elitism or gatekeeping to anyone on the outside looking in. But it isn't. It's just an amusing and albeit slightly soul-crushing critique on all the ways the series has been misrepresented by people who either know nothing about it or refuse to look beyond the surface. You may wonder how many of the comments on the bingo card are actually prevalent and not just conjurations of the creator's mind. But as someone who has actually sat down and read through conversations online about the franchise from people who have started but probably didn't even finish a single game from it, I can tell you that I, personally, have seen some of these statements in the wild before, especially after DMC5 came out. The criticism of the game's story being shallow because it's not serious 100% of the time is one that pops up on occasion, as does the strange, unprovoked comparison to the reboot, usually from some industry type that probably doesn't like Japanese games to begin with. A particularly funny one is calling the dynamic soundtrack boring because they couldn't get past a C style rank in combat, which actually kinda happened. The most common, however, and the one I saw most recently, which led me to make this video, is the criticism that the game feels like it's stuck in the PS2 era, which is kind of a silly thing to complain about considering how many classics came out that generation that still trump many games coming out today, but I digress. With each new Devil May Cry, the series becomes more technical, offers more options, and gives the players more ways to express themselves through combat. So why do people say things like that? Why is the gameplay for current-day Devil May Cry called clunky or aged or shallow when anyone who's put more than 5 minutes of effort into doing more than just mashing triangle would know otherwise? It's a question I've asked myself on occasion, and I know some of you may be thinking, look, it's not that deep. They're just dumb and don't know how to do more than just hit one button. Or maybe they're just trolls. It's not worth thinking too much about. And up until now, I would agree with that sentiment. But lately, especially with the reveal of DMC5 Special Edition, I've got to thinking about the actual gameplay experience and how it could lead a first-time player into making those remarks. I have to put myself back in the shoes of someone who hasn't played DMC before, which admittedly is a little difficult now because I've been a DMC fan for almost 16 years since the release of 3, but let's try. When you first start a DMC game, your moveset is typically somewhat limited. You're tasked with saving up red orbs, or in the case of DMC4, Proud Souls, to spend for more moves. Thus, early on, it's pretty common to rely on your most basic ground combo, distance closer, and air combo, assuming you even bother launching, to get you to the end of a mission. This does make sense because the game gives you the time to master your most elementary moves before you move on to the more complex stuff as you unlock them. And you never need to repurchase moves and abilities after buying them, even when you start a new game on a different difficulty. So, all things considered, it's a thoughtful progression system. But new players can make the mistake of assuming this opening experience is the game itself giving you the go-ahead to try and beat it by only spamming Combo A and Streak. This tends to lead the player down a path of stubbornly charging forward with little understanding of important techniques, such as jump canceling and bringer knuckle, and information such as the fact that literally any type of jump or dodge has invincibility frames that can make avoiding damage easier in tough fights. Why bother trying new moves when the game lets me get by with just mashing one button? That's the question some new players ultimately ask themselves and even remark online about the combat. And it leads them to believe the combat is shallow and old-fashioned, despite the game encouraging you to try more, and even to some extent showing you can do more through cutscenes with crazy action sequences. By being allowed to reach the end credits with only the most basic moves, some first-time players end up thinking the gameplay isn't deep at all, walking away with little lasting impressions, and this is because they're making the mistake of linking a game's depth to its skill floor as opposed to its skill ceiling. For clarity's sake, when I say skill floor, I refer to the minimum amount of effort required to make progress, while skill ceiling refers to the maximum amount of effort and complexity the game allows. Generally speaking, you can measure the depth of a game's combat by the gap between its skill floor and skill ceiling. When a new player's combat footage and a more experienced player's combat footage practically look like two different games, you can probably parse that the gameplay might be pretty deep. Thus, when discussing the depth of a game's combat, the estimation should be tied to the skill ceiling. Furthermore, some developers keep the skill floor purposefully low to ensure an easier barrier of entry, which is something that DMC obviously does, allowing you to choose an easy difficulty and turn on auto assist. However, players who lack perception may assume that the low skill floor is also symbolic of a low skill ceiling, because the game never forced them to perform better, and thus they never sought to do so. Which brings me to my next topic, forcing depth. Simply put, a lot of people don't bother to even make an attempt to play optimally unless the game forces them to, either by being particularly difficult or enforcing certain gameplay rules to make sure you regularly utilize specific mechanics that you may otherwise never touch. As an example of the latter, earlier this year, Doom Eternal got some criticism from certain people who disliked being forced to use the chainsaw for ammo or the flame belch for armor. But id Software made those mechanics a core part of the gameplay loop, and thus they are necessary to use so people didn't just sprint forward while holding down the trigger for their super shotgun. They gave Doom's combat more depth by creating a more complex procedure of mechanics with their own unique purposes that can be utilized at almost any time, and made them mandatory to the experience by constantly putting the player in situations where they'd have to use them. If id Software didn't enforce these new rules, and Doom Eternal gave the player a massive ammo pool and generous amounts of armor pickups by default, then a lot of players wouldn't bother with the chainsaw or flame belch at all. In fact, some may go the entire game without touching certain weapons, period. I love Doom Eternal, and I don't think the enforcement of these new mechanics is a bad thing, as I enjoy the much busier gameplay loop. But obviously it was going to alienate people who just wanted to feel like an untouchable god who could stride into a room and casually decimate demons without worrying about resources that aren't just ammo. Then there's forcing optimal play through general difficulty, meaning the game shoves the skill floor closer to the skill ceiling by way of sheer challenge. Character action games are already known to be pretty hard, often because bosses and some late-game enemies have a fairly complex set of moves themselves, and dealing with them in an optimal manner can take practice. But that's only if you choose a higher difficulty and actually aim to play stylishly. Some games don't even put those choices on the table, and decide to throw you into the deep end immediately. Coincidentally, the perfect example game for this actually came out only 2 weeks after DMC5. Sekiro. That's not to say its gameplay is bad in a general sense, because it's not. It's streamlined and easy to understand, but very hard to be competent at because the crux of the gameplay is timing. In Sekiro, you block and dodge attacks in rhythm with your enemy's offense to eventually break their posture and go in for the kill. With this comes the challenge of adapting to many enemies' varying attacks, some of which are very tightly timed or insanely aggressive. There's other mechanics thrown in like stealth elements, prosthetics, and combat arts, most of which are situational, if worth using at all, and perilous attacks, which are basically a game of deadly rock, paper, scissors, and various types of buffs you can apply to yourself for a temporary advantage. But the thing with Sekiro that some people dislike is that no matter what fight you're in, your actions are almost always going to be fundamentally similar. Deflect, deflect, dodge, hit, hit, deflect, deflect, death blow. You can utilize items, combat arts, and prosthetics to your heart's content to spice things up a bit, but the skeletal structure, so to speak, is going to be more or less the same for every major fight. Sometimes, assuming you aren't using cheese or speedrun methods, it feels like you spend more time watching the combat rather than participating, because it's the enemy who has total control over the pace of the fight, and you have to play more reactively than proactively in order to seize that control for yourself for only a short window of time before the cycle starts again. Because of the game's general difficulty and strict enforcement of its rote learning, players are forced to play closer to the skill ceiling, which invokes the idea in some people that it must be deep because of this. But difficulty is not depth in and of itself. For example, trying to throw a dime into an open water bottle from across the room is a very hard challenge that could take hundreds, maybe even thousands of attempts. But it's not a deep one. Again, I don't think Sekiro's combat is bad. If anything, its combination of simplicity and focus on repetition almost guarantees you'll never forget how the game works once you click with it. And getting back into the game over a year later won't be some monumental task. Games known for their technical depth can get away with having a large gap between skill floor and skill ceiling because as you climb there are more things to discover and utilize into your playstyle, and the more noticeably different the experience ultimately feels and looks. A great and widespread example of this is fighting games. Generally speaking, a fighting game's skill floor is decided by your opponent at the time, whether it be your little brother who barely knows how to jump and mash random buttons, or a local star that everyone in the neighborhood aims to beat, or an international legend that has a long list of championship wins. When someone takes the time and effort to climb the ladder and get closer to the ceiling, they begin to play differently and more efficiently, and eventually it seems like they're playing a different game entirely. But the willingness to actually climb has to be present within the player before they see the difference for themselves, and some games decide to force them upwards rather than risk them missing out. Games like Devil May Cry merely open a door of opportunity for you to learn more, and it's up to you to step through it. All of these things considered, I don't think DMC's positioning of its skill floor or ceiling should change. I think they're perfect where they are. Lifting the floor and forcing everyone to practically play like Donguri 990 would not only be frustrating to people who aren't interested in going that far, but it would also make skilled players like our friend here seem less special. Some people just start the game, play with the tiniest amount of effort allowed, and walk away from the experience criticizing the game for not forcing them to play better. It's a shame to realize, but some people really do need a gun pointed to their head to convince them to do more than just mash one button. Just as every game has a barrier of entry varying in height, every player has a barrier of stubbornness, and some games aim to break it down with force or just leave things up to you regardless of if you're playing how they encourage you to play or not. Perhaps the most ironic part about all of this is the fact that DMC keeps its skill floor reasonably low so people can hop in without being intimidated. But that same skill floor is used against it by these players who hate performing beyond the minimum. If I were Itsuno, I'd be pretty fucking annoyed. But then again, perhaps people like that are just not the target audience at the end of the day. This concludes my thoughts on the perception of combat depth regarding Devil May Cry and character action games at large. Obviously, this is all just my point of view on the subject, but if you have any different or additional thoughts, go ahead and leave a comment. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
Okay, that was a good one.